The alarming state of the American student in 2022. The pandemic was a wrecking ball for U.S. public education, bringing months of school closures, frantic moves to remote instruction, and trauma and isolation. Kids may be back at school after 3 disrupted years, but a return to classrooms has not brought a return to normal. After nearly 3 years of tracking pandemic response by U.S. school systems and synthesizing knowledge about the impacts on students, we sought to establish a baseline understanding of the contours of the crisis, what happened and why, and where do we go from here. This first annual State of the American Student report synthesizes nearly 3 years of research on the academic, mental health, and other impacts of the pandemic and school closures. It outlines the contours of the crisis American students have faced during the COVID-19 pandemic and begins to chart a path to recovery and reinvention for all students, which includes building a new and better approach to public education that ensures an educational crisis of this magnitude cannot happen again. The state of American students as we emerge from the pandemic is still coming into focus, but here's what we've learned, and haven't yet learned, about where COVID-19 left us. Students lost critical opportunities to learn and thrive. The typical American student lost several months' worth of learning in language arts and more in mathematics. Students suffered crushing increases in anxiety and depression. More than 1 in 360 U.S. children lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. Students poorly served before the pandemic were profoundly left behind during it, including many with disabilities whose parents reported they were cut off from essential school and life services. This deeply traumatic period threatens to reverberate for decades. The academic, social, and mental health needs are real, they are measurable, and they must be addressed quickly to avoid long-term consequences to individual students, the future workforce, and society. The average effects from COVID mask dire inequities and widely varied impact. Some students are catching up, but time is running out for others. Every student experienced the pandemic differently, and there is tremendous variation from student to student, with certain populations, namely, Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, as well as other vulnerable populations, suffering the most severe impacts. The effects were more severe where campuses stayed closed longer. American students are experiencing a K-shaped recovery, in which gaps between the highest and lowest scoring students, already growing before the pandemic, are widening into chasms. In the latest NAEP results released in September, national average scores fell 5 times as much in reading, and 4 times as much in math, for the lowest scoring 10% of 9-year-olds as they had for the highest scoring 10%. At the pace of recovery we are seeing today, too many students of all races and income levels will graduate in the coming years without the skills and knowledge needed for college and careers. What we know at this point is incomplete. The situation could be significantly worse than the early data suggest. The data and stories we have to date are enough to warrant immediate action, but there are serious holes in our understanding of how the pandemic has affected various groups of students, especially those who are typically most likely to fall through the cracks in the American education system. We know little about students with complex needs, such as those with disabilities and English learners. We still know too little about the learning impacts in non-tested subjects, such as science, civics, and foreign languages. And while psychologists, educators, and the federal government are sounding alarms about a youth mental health crisis, systematic measures of student well-being remain hard to come by. We must acknowledge that what we know at this point is incomplete, since the pandemic closures and following recovery have been so unprecedented in recent times. It's possible that as we continue to dig into the evidence on the pandemic's impacts, some student groups or subjects may have not been so adversely affected. Alternatively, the situation could be significantly worse than the early data suggest. Some students are already bouncing back quickly. But for others, the impact could grow worse over time. In subjects like math, where learning is cumulative, pandemic-related gaps in students' learning that emerged during the pandemic could affect their ability to grasp future material. In some states, test scores fell dramatically for high schoolers nearing graduation. Shifts in these students' academic trajectories could affect their college plans, and the rest of their lives. And elevated rates of chronic absenteeism suggest some students who disconnected from school during the pandemic have struggled to reconnect since. As they focus on recovery, school system leaders should look to these helpers not as peripheral players in education, but as critical contributors who can provide teaching, tutoring, or joyful learning environments for students and often have trusting relationships with their families. Recovery and rebuilding should ensure the system is more resilient and prepared for future crises. That means more thoughtful integration of online learning and stronger partnerships with organizations that support learning outside school walls. Every school system in America should have a plan to keep students safe and learning even when they can't physically come to school, be equipped to deliver high-quality, individualized pathways for students, and build on practices that show promise. Our State of the American Student report is the first in a series of annual reports the Center on Reinventing Public Education intends to produce through fall of 2027. We hope every state and community will produce similar, annual accounts and begin to define ambitious goals for recovery. The implications of these deeply traumatic years will reverberate for decades unless we find a path not only to normalcy but also to restitution for this generation and future generations of American students. The road to recovery can lead somewhere new. In 5 years, we hope to report that out of the ashes of the pandemic, American public education emerged transformed, more flexible and resilient, more individualized and equitable, and, most of all, more joyful.